my presentation, I will try to get as much as I can in this presentation to give you information and also for questions too. So if you have a question that pops up when I'm presenting, please put in the chat box and Alexis can address me with those questions. We could either answer it at the end of the presentation, or if it's a dire need, we can answer it at that moment in time. So I'm open to that also too, because we are in a learning environment. If you have questions, always ask. I tell people in trainings, there's no such thing as a stupid or dumb question, because sometimes we're afraid to do that. So go ahead and feel free to do that. I myself am an open book. I'm actually going to be sharing some personal experiences or things about myself within this context of the presentation. So I'm an open book as a Native transgender woman in educating our communities around issues within our communities. So our presentations around addressing the needs and gaps for best practices in tribal communities for Native LGBTQ Two-Spirit people. And what happened? Okay, so these are our objectives. Understand the diverse definitions of the community, identify strategies to provide proper services to LGBTQ, identify resources locally, statewide, and nationally, explain the diversity among transgender identities, identify strategies to do outreach to the Native LGBTQ Two-Spirit community, identify strategies on how to work effectively with LGBTQ Two-Spirit transgender individuals, model some examples of best practices. So of course, we probably know the definitions of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and queer. With gay, male attraction to same sex attraction, lesbian if you're attracted to a woman and you identify as a woman, bisexual, being attracted to both sexes, and it could be a variance in attraction also too. It could be more for men, it could be more for women, it could be equal, it could be vice versa. So with bisexual communities, how a person identifies plays a big part in their relationship with others. The word queer, I know there's different ways of addressing the word queer, especially with generational gaps. I know the younger generation is really embracing and empowering themselves with the word queer and identifying as queer also too. So as service providers, it's good to know this, and also with older generations like me, way up there, that the word queer, in my time, was used in a negative sense and a very derogatory slang words that were used. So within my generation, like for me, I when I hear the word queer, I kind of get triggered by that trauma that has caused. So even sometimes out of the blue, if somebody were to say word queer or something, sometimes I find myself twitching. So those things could happen. So always be mindful of the word queer and who uses it and how they use it and stuff. Transgender definition. Transgender is an umbrella term for persons whose gender identity, gender expression, or behavior does not conform to that typically associated with the sex to which they were assigned at birth. Gender identities refers to a person's internal sense of being male, female, or something else. Gender expression refers to the way a person communicates gender identity to others through behavior, clothing, hairstyles, voice, or body characteristics. Trans is sometimes used as a shorthand for transgender. While transgender is generally a good term to use, not everyone whose appearance or behavior is gender non-conforming will identify as a transgender person. The ways that transgender people are talked about in popular academia, and culture, and science are constantly changing, particularly as individuals' awareness, knowledge, and openness about transgender people and their experience grows. So this is part of the transgender umbrella, and people who identify within the spectrum can identify in different ways. Transgender, non-binary is being used a lot, gender non-conforming is being used a lot, so understanding that. So with non-binary, a lot of times what society tends to look at male and female only. So somebody who's non-binary doesn't identify either within that spectrum of male or female. The choice to identify as non-binary, in the same way with gender non-conforming. So we're seeing we see a lot of people within the recent years identify more with non-binary and gender non-conforming statuses. Trans women, trans men has really changed in definitions also too. I remember the lingo years ago where, like, even with data collection, they would put transgender male to female or female to male. So even that is changing as to where we either say trans woman or trans female or trans feminine or trans man, trans masculine, trans male. Those are some options that are being used that are less how would you say it, less of a negative way to identify our populations. Gender variance, part of the gender fluid, gender queer, cross-dresser, androgynous, omnigender, transsexual, and other ways. So for me as a trans individual, years ago, when I was around like 14 or 15, the only word that was around was transsexual. I didn't know about the word transgender until like the late 1990s, when people started identifying as transgender. So I identified with that. And that was the only identifier that was out. So after that, we saw a lot of, of different identifiers throughout the years. So even as a trans individual, even I had to educate myself around non-binary, gender non-conforming, all the new terms that were being used to identify oneself. So so let me go back. Oops, how do I go back? Okay, go back. So you're probably wondering why that I'm educating. The reason why I'm educating is because that's part of some of the best practices that we're developing and we're doing, is to educate the community, educate service providers on proper terminology, on definitions within communities. And a few of the definitions that I didn't put it up there that were listed in the beginning were like non-binary, gender non-conforming. Then also with Native LGBTQ Two-Spirit populations, the identity of Two-Spirit. So with Two-Spirit, the definition was coined in the early 1990s to identify Native LGBTQ communities to empower themselves coming from a community. And with the word Two-Spirit, an identifier of Two-Spirit, only people who are Native, of Native identity or Native descent can use Two-Spirit to identify themselves. We tend to hear people who are non-Native who are trying to identify as Two-Spirit, but it's an empowering term for our Native LGBTQ community and only should be used and identified within our communities. And then also being aware that not everybody identifies as Two-Spirit. That's one thing I like to point out to service providers. So with the identification of Two-Spirit, like for me, as an example, I don't identify as Two-Spirit. The reason why is because of the cultural context that I have around it. So from what I've learned with my teachings of my people, or when I was growing up, is that with the word with Two-Spirit, with our Diné population, we are born with male and female in one spirit. So if we were to have another spirit, that would bring a negative connotation, because that would represent being either demonized or possessed. So having to correct that, we'd have to have a ceremony done to correct those. So looking at it in that sense, like for me, that's why I don't identify as Two-Spirit. So because I look at that in that sense, but others do identify that. And it's a self-identifying term, and people may identify as Two-Spirit, some may not. So just also be aware of that also too, as a service provider, if you have programs or organizations, or even looking at paperwork or data collection on how you collect that data. And if you were to use the word Two-Spirit, be mindful that not everyone would identify under that too. So yeah, it all depends on how one identifies. Some do and some don't. So a little bit more education around gender identity and identifying. There's 4 basic concepts that are part of who we are and how we identify. The first one is your assigned sex at birth. Are you born male, female, or intersex? And a lot of times with identifiers, especially within paperwork or applications or documentation, we only have male and female, which is a binary concept. So we know we have people who are born intersex too. So having that option would be a good best practice. Looking at gender identity, how does one identify? You could be male, female, transgender, and any of those identities under the transgender umbrella that we saw. Gender expression, how one carries themselves, like in the definition of transgender, how we dress, how a person dresses, how they present themselves to the world, basically. And then also who you're attracted to. Sexual orientation is a part of that basic concepts of how we identify. So when I do trainings with service providers, we do an activity where we self-identify, and I would give like a little sticker to each participant, or even just in their mind think about where they could place themselves if we were to do a graph like the next slide. Oh shoot, skip that. So where do I fit in? So this is the graph that I was talking about. So the activity is identifying how one identifies. So anybody could do this regardless of their sexual orientation, their gender identity, who they are. So even you in the audience could be a part of this. I could give you like a sticker and you could place it on this bullet point anywhere you want to. So it's just about what just I expressed, the four basic concepts of identity. So for me, as an example, I was born male. So my sex assigned at birth is towards male. My gender identity right now is trans woman, trans feminine. So I would be more of going between possibly female and both, but more towards female. Gender expression would be more towards female, because I do present as a woman. I live as a woman 24/7, and I take on she and her pronouns. And that's another thing. Pronouns is very big also too. So best practices, asking about what pronouns one uses. So if you have people who are coming in who are non-binary, they could be using they, them, ze, or here pronouns. So always asking those, or even when introducing yourself, possibly using pronouns. And those could be some best practices. Some agencies actually do have name tags that have pronouns on them. So that's a good best practice to have. So going back to this slide and with self-identifying, so my dot would be more towards where female is around that spectrum. So there were different graphs that were being taught in a linear concept where it's like there was lines with this, but as Native populations, we found that because our mind frames more of a circular context emotion, that we can be anywhere, go anywhere, and stuff, that we use this as an example of that circular continuous idea. So with sexual orientation, who you're attracted to is separate from that self-identifier. So for me, who I'm sexually attracted to is my sexual partner's sex assigned at birth is male, and my partner's gender identity is male. How they express themselves is male, and they are all male. So for me, I identify as a heterosexual transgender woman. So I'm going to say that again. I identify as a heterosexual transgender woman. A lot of times when I say that remark, when I make that comment, I get people with their eyebrows raised or their eyes get big, and they're like, "No, you're gay. You can't be heterosexual." I'm like, wait a minute, what makes you want to identify myself? So the reason why I say that is because I'm a trans woman. I live as a woman, and I'm attracted to men, and I'm also attracted to heterosexual men, not gay men. So one of the biggest things that I tell people in trainings all the time is that always think about what's between the ears and not what's between the legs. So because of those eyebrows being raised and the eyes getting big, it's that ideology that people have. They thinking about what's between my legs rather than what's between my ears. And that's always happened within our communities where we would identify in that way. And I've actually had people say like, well, that means you're gay, or your partner's gay, or that's a gay relationship. I'm like, no, I'm not attracted to gay men. I'm attracted to heterosexual men, and I view myself as a woman, so I feel I'm heterosexual. So in that relationship with male and female, so I'm gonna use that binary concept. For me, it's that relationship in the and looking at it as in a heterosexual relationship, and not thinking about what's between my legs or thinking about what's sexually. So, so a lot of times in trainings, we have to really like dissect that and really talk about those things. So as best practices, like knowing your community, because there's different variations, especially within trans communities on how we identify. And then also you have to look at identifiers with like the acronym of LGBTQ. So with trans populations, it's an identity. It's who we are. And with GLB and Q, it's more of like who you're attracted to. So for a trans person, like for me, like a transgender person can be heterosexual, gay, lesbian, bisexual, and identify as queer if they wanted to. So that's why so that's why we discuss that and we talk about it and we say in that sense. So moving forward, I'm jumping into another category. So one of the things around best practices is also data collection, knowing your resources within the communities. What resources do you have? What is out there that you could look at, especially within tribal communities, and what you could use, especially with funding. I know there's a lot of agencies and organizations that try to do proposals. They write and they're trying to look for resources for data collection or what they can put into their proposals. And this document right here could be a part of that, especially with trans communities. So in 2010, they did a survey with a little over 6,500 people around the nation, including Puerto Rico, Guam, and the US Virgin Islands. And they asked a bunch of questions, did a survey, people filled it out, and they found alarming statistics within the survey. So they named it Injustice at Every Turn. So there's a document out there in 2011 or 12, I believe, that came out highlighting this survey that was done. And then fast forward to 2015, they actually did another survey of the same context and started in June of 2015, ended in September of 2015. And a lot of outreach was done to a trans populations. So this time around, there were over 27,000 participants who filled out these surveys and questionnaire. So there's documentation out there around these questions. So what they found is pervasive, like this mistreatment, discrimination within our communities and all spectrums and all levels: housing, employment, incarceration, law enforcement, violence, you name it. There were statistics that were done that's eyebrow raising and stuff. So the first survey that they did, one of the biggest things that they saw was a 42% suicide rate within that population. And that's alarming compared to the 5% of the national average. And this was with people who identified more of the trans spectrum. And so in looking at that, it's very alarming. And as trans people who do education and training within our communities, we find that people who have followed through with suicide can't fill out surveys. So we feel that those numbers and those statistics are a lot higher, maybe even surpassing like 60, 70%. So that is very alarming to see and know. So those same questions and that same section with suicide within this survey in 2015 just showed like maybe a 1% decrease. So the average was around 41%, I believe. So within this survey, they also did subpopulations, as you could see on this bottom three pictures. There's the report on the experience of Black respondents, report on the experience of Latina respondents, and also report on the experience of American Indian, Alaska Native respondents. And I was actually asked to help to be a part of getting that together also too, and giving recommendations on writing that document. So that is out there. So some of the things that were found in here, like I said, there was over 27,000 respondents. They saw pervasive mistreatment and violence. 1 in 10 reported violence because of their identity. 8% were kicked out for being transgender. One of the things that really made me think is looking at the kindergarten through 12th grade statistics with trans individuals. 54% of the respondents verbally were harassed, 24% were physically attacked. And this is the one that really gets me, is like 13% sexually assaulted. And this is kindergarten through 12th grade. So being sexually assaulted as a trans person, a lot of times we don't report these things because of fear and other stuff that could happen. So looking at this, I'm like, who's protecting our trans population in schools? Because discrimination, assault, and violence still does occur in schools, and we're hearing it to this day that happens, and things are still going on within communities where trans people are violently being treated and then also being murdered or either go missing. 17% left school as a result of mistreatment. So having to leave school. And then also sometimes that statistic will be part about getting kicked out of school. So if somebody's being bullied and harassed almost every single day, they fight back, they get into a fight, they beat up somebody and they're kicked out of school. That could also be a result of that too, but not looking at how they're being treated, but they're looking at the actions and stuff. So how does that enforce and empower somebody who is living a life of being transgender? So other statistics that have happened: severe economic hardships and instability we're seeing in here. 29% living in poverty, 15% unemployment rate, 30% experience homelessness sometime in their life, 12% experience homelessness in year prior to the survey. There were harmful effects on physical and mental health. 39% experience psychological distress compared to the 5% of the US population. So for trans populations, like mental health services are in need, so in dire need. So for best practices, how do we develop resources for trans individuals within behavioral health services? What are we doing to include them? What are we doing to outreach to the community, especially when they have to face trauma or deal with trauma? Do you have trauma-informed care, trauma-informed counseling that could be done within our trans communities? I come from the community, so I've seen it. I've experienced it, and I'm also work with the population where sexual assault has occurred or violence has occurred or murder has occurred. And there's a lot of violence that happens to add to that trauma. Even PTSD is a part of that. So how do we work with the population to get them the resources and the help that they need within our communities? And also, is services inclusive of not just trans population, but also of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and queer communities? So that statistic that I was talking about, it's 40% attempted suicide in their lifetime, almost 9 times the rate of the US population. 33% who sought healthcare had a negative experience. So healthcare, we're talking about healthcare, and I know there's clinicians probably in this conference. And so I remember years ago where I would go to the hospital and sometimes I would be asked questions and stuff. So some people didn't know that I was trans, so they'd be asking me when my last period was, when was my last pregnancy, yada yada. So I would have to inform the doctor that I was trans, and sometimes even like educate either the doctor or the nurse around being transgender, maybe even what questions to ask, like, hey, this is what happened, so this is what we should look at too, or I'm very sexually active, so risk factors, risk behaviors, what tests can I do? So I'm a trans woman, so I still have my prostate, or this is what's going on, so I might have a male anatomy still on the inside, but appear as a woman on the outside. So what stuff should I look at? I take hormones, so my breast grew. So do I do a mammogram in my later years? So what do I do, or what do I look for? Looking at heart conditions, especially with trans populations because of my hormone treatment. So I think we do a lot of self-educating within our own population, and when we do hormone therapy or doing transition, that sometimes we have to inform healthcare providers on what they have to look for, what they should test for within ourselves. And thankfully, those things are being addressed with some of the best practices that I'm going to mention a little later, because I have a list of some of the stuff that's being done currently. So next one, the survey saw compounding impact of other forms of discrimination. We saw that trans people of color experience deeper and broader patterns of discrimination. So with trans people of color, the average lifespan for a trans person of color is the age of 37. The age of 37. And I've seen several of my sisters pass away before the age of 37. And it's not just few. It's, I could say by either a dozen or a couple dozens, actually more than a couple of dozens of people that I know who died at a young age, maybe of not violence, but like substance use issues, cirrhosis of the liver, health conditions, different things that attributed to their health because of the stuff that they go through within their lifetime. I'm 49, so I'm past that marker, but I'm still susceptible to violence. I'm still susceptible to harm. Somebody may not like me as being transgender, that they could come after me and hurt me, or even try to kill me if they wanted to, because that's how severe it could get. So I just wanted to mention that. Increased visibility and growing acceptance, increase of respondents happen, and there's a lot more visibility within this survey that was done because they included non-binary, genderqueer, gender fluid, gender non-conforming as a part of the survey. And speaking of surveys, they're actually recruiting now to do outreach, to do another survey, I believe, as of this year to start, and 2 years down the road, we are going to have new statistics around another survey. So be on the lookout for that. And that could be part of that best practices, is being on the lookout for our next survey. That's the next survey that's going to be done nationwide. So I would mention that they also did a report for experience of American Indian Alaska Native respondents. And I think that goes really good with the conference and what we're doing for our tribal communities. So these are statistics that tribal communities could look at and present to entities, where if they want to start a program or if they want to start outreach to communities, that this gives evidence of why those services are needed or why inclusion is needed within those service provider agencies around mental health or even healthcare services, or even just getting groups together or providing equal services as with any other group or entity, especially youth populations. So within just the Native American Indian Alaska Native respondents, we saw the alarming rates of, with kindergarten to 12th grade, 92% experienced mistreatment, such as being verbally harassed, prohibited from dressing according to their gender identity. I've heard stories of boarding schools where teachers, dorm assistants, people in the higher positions telling trans kids, like, you're not supposed to wear makeup, don't dress like a girl, and telling them how to dress, not to wear and stuff. So even administration was a part of that. Authoritative people were part of the discrimination within school settings. Disciplined more harshly or physically or sexually assaulted because people thought they were transgender. 69% were verbally harassed, 49 were physically attacked, 24 were sexually assaulted. Family, 55% were generally supportive. And I think for me, I think that percentage right there is the higher, because with Native populations, we come from a family dynamic ideology where family is important and stuff too, but not everyone gets that same treatment, and it's changing because of assimilation, acculturation, the colonization that we talk about, of how we look at different things. And colonization does play a big part in how we think of certain populations, and also could be challenging and hurtful for especially LGBTQ two-spirit populations when trying to provide these services, because people may have their own personal beliefs that they're bringing into service work. So 60% experienced at least one form of family rejection, 18% ran away from home due to being trans. And usually when somebody runs away from home, they tend to go to the bigger cities. And in some of the bigger cities, we do have trans populations where they are homeless. Here in Albuquerque, we do have a transgender resource center, but we find that there is a big population of Native trans women who are homeless and seeking services to get housed and be resourced to services, which the resource dinner does well. And our organization at First Nation, where I work for, actually does provide services and works with Transgender Resource Center to work with our populations that we're talking about. So more statistics, and I'm gonna do a time check on myself, okay? I better move along. So these are more statistics, and like they said, this is going to be recorded and be up for a little while, so you can go back to it and look at it. So these are more statistics, and if you want to Google or research this, you could go find these documents and research also what I'm talking about. So some of the best practices that are currently happening around is like in Gallup, New Mexico, they actually have a trans clinic at an Indian Health Services hospital. Dr. Wei is phenomenal. I love her. I'm always promoting her. She has over 150 clients in her trans clinic that she runs. She provides hormone therapy. She provides the gender affirming care the best way that she knows how and what's available. So we're lucky to have her on near the reservation. Gallup is a border town, but we do have a big hospital there where trans people do come to get services. I know that there's a trans individual that drives all the way from Tuba City to get services there. Like that's like a 5-hour drive. I think it's a 5-hour or 3-hour. Well, they drive long distances just to get healthcare as a trans individual. So you have to also look at that like, oh my gosh, just to get healthcare that's affirming to one person's identity, they have to drive that far and back and use those resources just to get the care that they want and need. So Dr. Wei is so wonderful and great. If you ever come across a presentation where Dr. Wei is presenting, please sit in on her presentation and learn about like best practices, what they're doing in healthcare for Indian Health Services and around the country, or even just in certain areas. Trans and gender affirming care, adult echo. Northwest Portland Area Indian Health Board is leading this with other peer support people, peer faculty, and also professional faculty, where like mental health services or clinicians can get on this echo, and they do have case studies and they do didactics where they talk about certain populations and stuff, and they do have a case study each time that people are meet, and they give recommendations on how to provide services for a client who they may be seeing, especially in the Indian Health Service sector or a 638 or an urban clinic that they're from. And so they get recommendations from peer faculty or peer faculty, especially if they're clinicians. So that could be one thing. So if we have clinicians on here or mental health service people, they could possibly get involved with ECHO and get a hold of Morgan Thomas with the Northwest Portland Area Indian Health Board and see how they can be a part of that ECHO. Native Advocacy Work Group for Trans Health. So that's actually a group that's looking at Indian Health Services affirming healthcare for Native LGBTQ Two-Spirit populations. So that's being worked on and looking at and developing policies that will include us, be with us, and help us to be a part of that. Because because as we see, Indian Health Services may not have those policies to really affirm somebody who is Native LGBTQ or Two-Spirit identifying and seeking services and what they need, especially for trans individuals. Establishing LGBTQ Two-Spirit committees as part of that best practices in your agencies or organizations. I work for First Nations Community Health Source, and we actually have an LGBTQ committee, advisory committee. And our organization services all populations, even undocumented populations. There are a few programs that are specific to Native populations. So we do have Native representation who are part of this small committee. So that's actually best practice that could happen, where if you have internal committees that could address some of these issues to change policy, or how do we follow these procedures, or what can we do to include LGBTQ populations in paperwork, data collection, or even services within an agency and organization that could be done as a best practice. One of the things that I do as work as some of those best practices. So Native Men, Native Voices is actually an adaptation of the Many Men, Many Voices curriculum that's out there, that's recommended by CDC. It's a six-session workshop, and it addresses dual identity, influencing factors, HIV, STI education, risk continuum, stages of change, who's got the power, role play. It's an evidence-based curriculum, and it's focused around HIV prevention. So we went to a training, we got trained on this, and we adapted it for our Native gay men population, to work with them in our communities, especially in the Northwest region of New Mexico. And our Navajo Nation is in 3 states, New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah. So if somebody was from Utah or Arizona that wanted to come to a workshop, they were more than welcome because they're in the Northwest region and stuff. So they would be part of that. And my facilitator that I work with is identified as a Native gay man, and he's done the workshop curriculum training too. So I consult with him, and he's actually my lead facilitator in these workshops. That one of the best practices that you do is, if you have a curriculum that you do workshops, the best thing to do is to have somebody of that population, of that identifier, be the sole and lead facilitator within that workshop or that intervention, because it's peer-to-peer. Like, I identify as a Native trans woman, so I feel that me facilitating and leading a gay men's workshop is not going to work and not going to happen. And there could be that misconnection, there could be bias that could happen, and I don't identify as a gay man, so there may be things that I say or wording that I say that be different than what gay men would say, or I would say those or them could sometimes be sometimes feel people could be discriminated against by saying those things. So best practice is to always get somebody of the population to work with interventions and workshops within the area. And on the right side of the screen is the core elements of that curriculum, the original curriculum. So when adapting curriculum also too, as long as you keep the core elements of the curriculum and you're implementing like cultural context or history or education, or in the curriculum you talk about certain things coming from your group population. And we have a lot of tribal communities throughout the country. We have over 550 tribal identified communities throughout the nation. So all of our tribes are different, and our cultures are different. Our language could be different also too. So not just one type of curriculum is going to work for everybody. So the curriculum that we do around our area may not work with maybe the East Coast. So even changing a little bit of the cultural context or the history or how people look at different ways of approaching could be a part of that. So tweaking can be done. So I always say that if there's a will, there's a way. And then also that if you do the right changes within the interventions or workshops that you do, those are the best practices that you're bringing to the community and to the table. Another intervention that we do is called Native Sista. This actually comes from a curriculum also by CDC. It's evidence-based. The curriculum is Sista. So it's sisters informing sisters on the topic of AIDS. So the original curriculum was a 5-session workshop, and the right side is the core elements of that curriculum. So I had a Native trans sister who also worked in the position of doing HIV prevention, and she adapted a curriculum that fit more for our Native trans population in the area. And we have predominantly Diné Navajo trans women within our areas. So by doing this, she created a 4-session workshop and implemented cultural teachings, cultural identity, history of Native LGBTQ people. In the curriculum, it talks about gender power, HIV, STI education, assertiveness skills, and resources within the curriculum. But I think one of the biggest things was part of the PowerPoint presentation that she created, where it has education around the history of who we are as Native LGBT, especially trans people, and then also evidence of research that was done within our people, and to give empowerment. So I'm going to use a couple of slides from that presentation that she developed and show you a little bit about what we're talking about. So with SISTA, we're actually thinking of kind of changing it again, because we feel that we've worked with a lot of our Native trans sisters in the community, and this is specific to Native trans women and stuff, because we do talk about healthcare stuff. We talk about transition, we talk about affirming surgeries, we talk about hormone therapy, we talk about transition, we talk about living as a trans woman, what resources are out there, what we can do to assist, what we can do to live a productive life, how do we empower our community and stuff. So there's certain things that are part of this workshop. So we're actually thinking of tweaking this curriculum a little bit and including like substance use and abuse, also including like new initiatives like U equals U, which is undetectable equals untransmittable, looking at PrEP, how to utilize PrEP or PEP and stuff. So really looking at changing some of that and giving that education. So the next slides are going to be from some of the curriculum, especially the PowerPoint she developed. So with Native LGBTQ Two-Spirit community, we know we were here before colonization. And a lot of times we don't highlight or we don't educate on the history of who we are and where we come from, and prominent people who were part of history, who were seen and recognized and looked up to. So a lot of times when it comes to LGBTQ populations, people highlight Stonewall. Yay, Stonewall. Stonewall is the catalyst of gay rights. For me as a Native trans individual, I don't look at Stonewall as that catalyst. I look at people who are part of the history, like either in the late 1800s, because that's when things were starting to be documented. Even before colonization, I know we were part of our tribal communities. We were part of our groups, and we were part of our communities where our roles and what we could provide to our families or to our community or our tribe was looked at, rather than what was between our legs or our identity and being different and stuff. A lot of colonization has taught us to discriminate and also remove certain populations from our tribal communities, or give the ideology of that it's wrong, so we shouldn't include them. So a lot of things have changed within history. So this is like that example, like Wewa, she was of the Zuni tribe, and in contemporary context, maybe she could have been identified as a trans woman. So she had different roles that she provided to the community. She wove, she did pottery, she was a healer, farmer, domestic goddess basically, and did things, represented the tribe, went to Washington, went to different places, and represented the tribal community until they found out that she was different. And so that all changed. And there's actually a book on Wewa that you could actually read and resource also too. Another prominent person is Oshtish, finds them and kills them. Also could be known as Makati Jim. So Oshtish was an expert seamstress, efficient cook, artisan. She wore women's clothing, and she said, "This is my road," because they asked her like why she dressed in women's clothing, and she's like, "This is my road." Inclined to be a woman, never a man, is what she said also too. She was also a warrior. So the way she got her name is that she saved fellow tribesmen with another woman when their community was being attacked, that they did that. So, and then so Chief Pretty Shield actually told I believe the interviewer or whoever was talking about them, that I felt proud of the two women. So knowing that the chief identified Oshtish as a woman also too, tells me that she was accepted, and that they looked at her as a woman, and they looked at her in the role that she presented and did, and that was no problem. 1890, there was attempts to assimilate her. And I'm saying her because that's how I feel that she was. So I'm and stuff. So Oshtish is not around to say, this is my gender identity, this is my pronouns. So that's how I view it as a trans woman. So they were forced to change clothes, cut hair, and work as a man for many years, Chief Pretty Eagle defended her, took her out of that environment, brought her back to the tribal settings, and let her remain to live her life until she passed away in 1929. So the picture that you see on top where she's wearing her burial outfit, she wanted to show that. So that's what she wanted to highlight, is that's what she wanted to be buried in. So she represented as a woman, so she was more feminine. Other stuff that we see in history, and these are all documented history too. So anthropologists documented these things. So one of the things that we tell our groups and our workshops is that anthropology is one-sided. So back then we didn't have Native anthropologists. We did in a certain way, like with teaching cultural context and stuff, but as to writing on paper, more of the anthropology was being done by people from the outside, people who are non-native, of what they saw. So what they saw and what they thought was a part of those writings or documentation. So their bias and their beliefs came into play, especially when they saw Native LGBTQ people within tribal settings, because of their personal beliefs. Seeing like a man and man together might have been wrong in their eyes, so they may have documented in that way. So a lot of it was kind of comes from a negative context. But if we had Native anthropologists back then, a lot of that would be different. We'd have a different ideology of how we looked at history, especially with Native LGBT communities. So within Maitanet culture, there's also like Haskingpla, who represented like different things, established trade for weavers, wove sand paintings, was also a medicine person, helped start Real White Museum, preserved Navajo culture. And this was also documented too. So when Haskingpla was around, he would dress more androgynous, dressed how they felt when they woke up and through that day and stuff. So they were themselves when these interviews and these documentations were being done. So we give a history of that, and was very instrumental in a lot of the things that were being provided to our people. So some of the like ceremonies that we don't have no longer and become extinct, this person knew some of those. And so as time goes on, we look at how assimilation and acculturation is still happening. So how do we hang on to those cultural teachings or those cultural understanding? Even language sometimes could be hard within our people. So other people like Kenneth Ba, so identified as intersex, was a potter, a healer. And I never heard of this person until Stella did her research and said this is a person who was from towards Crown Point area, from Buckstore, New Mexico, and I've never heard of that. And so having to learn about this, especially as a Native trans person, empowered me, because this is the Eastern Agency where I'm from. So having this documentation of somebody who is intersex, who is from the area, and also was a healer and was a midwife too, and a potter, and shows a picture of doing the pottery work that they have and how they dress, is that history that I feel is giving evidence to empower myself to be who I am, and not think of the negative things that are being said about me as a Native person, especially the Native LGBTQ two-spirit person. So some of the documentations that I think really stood out in this PowerPoint that she did also too was the interviews that W.W. Hill did. So our own Navajo people talked good about our population years ago. And this was around like the late 1800s, early 1900s. One of the persons said they know everything. They can do both the work of a man and a woman. I think when all the Nugle are gone, that it will be the end of the Navajo. If there were Nugle, the country would change. They are responsible for the wealth of the country. If there were no more left, the horses, sheep, and Navajo would all go. They are leaders just like President Roosevelt. So that we were highly revered. A Nugle around the Hogan will bring good luck and riches. They have charge of all the riches. It does a great deal for the country if you have a Nutle around. You must respect a Nutle. You are somehow sacred. They are somehow sacred and holy. So within our tribal teachings, we had inclusion of our populations. So my thought is like, where did we go wrong? Where did all this change? And of course, assimilation, acculturation, colonization is a big part of why these things changed. which is the next slide, the shift. So this was more towards like the 1930s with interviews. The knuckle are not so much respected nowadays. The older attitude is giving way to one of ridicule. Any child showing a tendency to a transformation is discouraged. 1930 to 40, husking claw, not wearing women's clothing due to outside influences of acculturation. So people were probably making comments or being derogatory. And so a shift in wearing clothes changed. Showed his status through creativity, combining both genders in his character, occupation, religious practice, and philosophy. Also changing attitude toward Native LGBTQ, white ridicule, assimilative agents, BIA boarding schools, Christianity. So organized religion played a big part of this too. We know about boarding schools. We know about BIA boarding schools. So with boarding schools, I feel that somebody who was transgender who went into a boarding school, how was that looked at? And also because of all the evidence of burials that you see within boarding school era and around those things, and we're seeing evidence of that, like how many might have been killed because of their identity. That's kind of a question that goes through my head. Like out of all these children that are found in these burial sites, how many of them were LGBTQ two-spirit people? And were they killed because of their identity or what happened? Those questions go through my head. Another a workshop that we do is healthy relationships for people living with HIV. And it's a 5-session workshop that is also evidence-based and looks at disclosure to family and friends about status, disclosure to sexual partners, safer sex, decision-making skills, all go into this curriculum. So I'm kind of moving along really quick because we're running out of time. We may be going over 5 minutes. Is that okay, Alexis?
Yeah, that should be fine.
Yeah, awesome. So some of the etiquettes, best practices, respectfully. So as service providers, these are some of the things we tell service providers how to be an awesome ally, what etiquette to use, what things you could do in your best practices, especially for your agency or organizations and trainings. Respectfully ask someone how they would like to be addressed if you're not sure. Can I ask you a personal question, or which pronoun do you go by? What name would you like to go by? Is there another name you go by? How would you like to be referred to in terms of gender? Those are proper questions. And a lot of times when we hear, can I ask you a personal question? We know that, have you had surgery, or are you a man or a woman? So asking nicely is a really good best practice, especially for a service provider, and being inclusive, and that they ask you why. And then if somebody comes off offensive or aggressive really quick, understand that this person may have gone through trauma, may have gone through years and years of being told differently or had negative experiences with people that's their automatic reaction too. So as service providers, sometimes I tell people to be wary of that too, because sometimes there could be that trigger point or that reminder and stuff, or it could be a question that they got so often or in a negative sense that when they hear it, they might just get reactionary right away. So be mindful of that. How to be that awesome ally and provider. Remember the etiquette tips. Be mindful of LGBTQ people in office or waiting rooms. Especially with trans people. If their documentation or their names haven't been changed, like my name was Manuel, so I changed it legally to Maddie in 2017. So if I'm in a waiting room and I look as a woman, present as a woman, nobody knows that I'm trans, and they called Manuel Jim, and I got up and went to the window, what do you think people would think? And so those things have happened. I've been in waiting rooms where they called my name Manuel, but I would wait until somebody else was called or 2 other people were called. And then I would go to the window and say, you called me earlier and I'm Manuel and stuff. And even doing that, sometimes I whisper like, I'm Manuel. So be mindful of names, especially calling in waiting rooms. Don't police public restrooms. Restrooms is a big issue, especially for trans people. If you have a single occupancy restroom in your agency or facility, change it to a gender neutral restroom. Because if it just only occupies one person, that the door is locked, anybody could use that restroom regardless. If you have single occupancy restrooms that are male and female, make them both gender gender neutral restrooms. Even if it has a urinal where somebody stands, people identify that as a male restroom. It's not. It's just somewhere somebody could pee and stand at. Yeah, but there is a toilet, so anybody could use it. So be mindful of that. Don't ask about a transgender person's genitals unless it has to do directly with the care or treatment they are seeking from you. So like clinicians, if I have a sore throat, ask me about my sore throat and my illness, not about did I get surgery or do I still have my penis or do I still have my genitals and stuff. So those things do happen and they still do happen. Remember, being LGBTQ is not a choice. I get that a lot. If I had a choice, really, I would be a heterosexual man to have kids, married, and living my life and having maybe a trade and working and not be transgender, because I feel it's hard to live as a trans woman, but I have no control over that. This is me, this is who I am, I'm happy, and this is who I'm going to be and live. So I don't have a choice in this, because we get that also too, especially even service providers have said these things. I tell service providers and trainings too, like if your personal beliefs come into the play in the work that you do, then it's time to find a new job. And it's true, because how are you going to provide equal, adequate service to every single person and look at everybody equal, but you have biases against LGBTQ populations? That doesn't play right. So that's some of the best practices to look at too. Be willing to do your homework. Never deny. Be willing to do your homework, meaning like there's the power of internet, Google, ask questions, go to training, sign up for webinars. There's a lot that are going around everywhere. To never deny LGBTQ person care or service because of your personal beliefs. Treat LGBTQ people to spirit with the courtesy and respect you would like to be treated with. Be sensitive that most transgender medical needs are not covered by insurance, which is true. So like transitioning, Medicaid may not cover that. You have to appeal and appeal to get it covered. So things are changing, but they're changing slowly around like medical needs and insurance. Advocate for cultural fluency, not just around like teaching of Native culture and traditions, but also other cultural stuff, LGBTQ populations, other entities, other cultures, other groups, other subgroups. Be aware that transgender people may have a name or other information or records that. So documentation, looking at your documentation. I guarantee if you go back to your office and you look at your application or documentation process, you're gonna find male and female. Or you don't have a two-part question where it's your sex assigned at birth, male, female, or intersex. The second one being what is your gender identity? Is male, female, trans woman, trans men, trans masculine, trans feminine, non-binary, gender non-conforming, gender queer, and then having a line that says additional, and then a line where they can fill it in themselves. I discourage using other. I do not like the word other. We other people all the time, especially in data collection. We categorize people as other, especially as Native people. We've been done that so many times, and even as LGBTQ people, we don't like that. So don't other people if you cannot help it. Don't do it. So that's best practices. Don't use other. So giving those options could be great. If there's policies in place, because a lot of times people talk about policies and hide behind policies. Well, that's our policy. Policies can be changed. Let me repeat that. Policies can be changed. Address it, get a group together. There's ways policies can be rewritten and changed. It can happen and it will happen if people work on it. So please do that. If agencies or organizations are not inclusive of LGBTQ populations or service providing to them, please change policies. Don't just add the T. A lot of times, including just transgender doesn't mean that you're inclusive. Do you have transgender people working for you? Do you have LGBTQ two-spirit people working for you in services where you're saying that you're inclusive and you're providing affirmative health care for them? Do you have board members who are identified as Native LGBTQ, transgender two-spirit people? Do you have people who come to your services? Do you outreach from other people? Do you hire them? Do you put them in leadership? All of that plays a big part in best practices. Become an active ally for the LGBTQ two-spirit population. Call out transphobic, homophobic remarks and jokes. Those things still do happen all the time. People joke about gay trans people. They put up pictures, memes, social media. A lot of memes go around about stuff like pictures of Caitlyn Jenner and crazy wordings. Every time I see that, even though she's not Native, and I may have my own bias against Caitlyn Jenner and what she represents, she still is transgender and she is still my population. But seeing memes around her that are jokes and derogatory kind of affects me, because what they're looking at her and representing is what they're also probably looking at me as a Native trans woman too. So sometimes those get under my hide, especially with memes when people think it's a joke, but it's hurtful. Resist the urge to place others in boxes. Like I said, don't stereotype. How do we mend those rainbows within our systems? Create supportive systems, build trust, honor traditions and culture. Like I gave a little example of history, documented history of Native LGBTQ in the late 1800s and actual pictures. Eliminate homophobia, transphobia, educate services, law enforcement, social issues, same partner, domestic violence, all entities, all programs, identify appropriate resources, reassess protective protocols, regardless of where you work, whatever you have in your tribal communities or entities. Become knowledgeable in LGBT state, federal, and tribal laws. There are a lot of tribal laws that don't include policies within communities and addressing LGBTQ communities across the board. So do you have hate crimes bill in your tribe? Do you have a non-discrimination act in your tribe? Do you have hate crime? Do you have discrimination laws that protect LGBTQ community? Do you have tribal insurance that also covers LGBTQ populations, Two-Spirit, or their partners? Looking at those, it makes a big difference in how we provide better services and have best practices for the population. And if there is not, how do you make those changes? One of the resources that are listed at the end is the Tribal Equity Toolkit that looks at how you change policy, how you form documentations, especially in judicial systems, and changing some of those laws or in placing some of those policies, especially within tribal settings and laws. So that'd be a good resource to look at if you're into those. What was I? Creating ordinances and or policies to protect Native LGBTQ and Two-Spirit individuals and community, address homelessness, substance use and abuse, same partner violence, discrimination, hate, HIV, STIs, employment, adequate healthcare, addressing those social determinants of health that we are always talking about across the board, but also include our Native LGBTQ Two-Spirit people a part of that process. Advocate to change, inclusion. Big thing is intentional inclusion of Native LGBTQ Two-Spirit people on all levels, providing services and also employing our populations, being on board membership, asking us to be part of advisory committees in your entities or your tribal communities. Seek out those gatekeepers. I guarantee every single tribal community across the nation has a gatekeeper or somebody they know is LGBTQ Two-Spirit that is representative and also is a part of the community that could give great knowledge. So what are some of the needs and gaps within our communities? And I feel that like what we're talking about today, I see both needs and gaps that are the same for stuff that I had listed. What are the needs that we need? We need funding for our populations. We need more resources, more direct services. We need transportation for our populations, especially in rural settings, very rural settings. Looking at housing for our populations. Are we including our population in these service parameters? Representation of Native LGBTQ Two-Spirit on all levels within our tribal communities. Appropriate history, meaning not just talking about our Native history and our Native culture of our people, but also including LGBTQ who were a part of that Native history and culture, like we saw with the pictures and what I had talked about. Data collection, looking at data, how do we implement and getting data for Native LGBTQ Two-Spirit people within our tribal communities. Looking at the gaps, how do we fill those gaps? What gaps are still there? One of the gaps is, like I said, looking at the number of tribes within our nation. Sometimes that could be a huge gap because all different services or different parameters could be in place for different tribal communities because we're not cookie cutter. We all have our different and separate cookie maker or cookie cutter. So it's not just one shape, it's all different sizes and shapes. Rural versus urban. That's a big thing, especially in tribal communities. Direct services, there's still those gaps, the resources, transportation, housing, substance use and abuse entities. Sometimes it's hard for me to get a trans sister into treatment because treatment centers like, oh, we've never worked with trans people before. Oh, we've never had them before. Like I went to treatment. I've been sober 26 years. I went to treatment the first time it worked for me. And I can talk about the discrimination that I faced in treatment, but I persevered and I came out of it in a good way. But I have also had bad experience in treatment where it could have triggered me to go out and relapse and do things again, but it didn't. But having to deal with that, having to be almost being reminded that two people could jump me and beat me up and being threatened and stuff. So I didn't report that. So looking at that, what are some of the stuff that are still happening and how could we be inclusive and helping our population around those issues? Because substance use and abuse is very big within our Native LGBTQ two-spirit community. Social determinants of health, how do we address those? Like I said earlier, looking at data collection, there's still gaps in there. How do we be inclusive and how do we get proper data? Questions? Is there any questions? Oh, I went way over.
Yeah, I don't see any in the chat. If you guys have any questions, feel free to ask in the chat or you can take yourself off mute.
Okay, and then the resource list, there's a lot of resources that are listed. So please go through that, look at some of the stuff that I had talked about, especially the Tribal Equity Toolkit. And then also the Spotlight on Two-Spirit Communities, National Congress, American Indians, and then the Celebrating Our Magic Toolkit, Indian Health Services. So Northwest Portland Area Indian Health Board put together a toolkit around healthcare with Indian Health Services, and they have a toolkit that you could order. You could have posters, brochures, stuff that you could put up in your waiting rooms that could be inclusive. Also, another recommendation is doing a safe zone training for your agency or your clinic or your community and putting up stickers where people can see it who are of the community that, hey, this is a safe zone. I could feel safe in here. Yeah. So these are great resources just to look. Like I said, do your homework, like go through here and look at all those resources.